In September 2002, the body of a cave diver was brought to the coroner's office on the island of Salta in Croatia. The body had been recovered from the bottom of a deep underwater cave in Poganesa, and it was initially assumed that he had simply drowned whilst trying to find the exits. However, this body was different. On closer examination, the coroner discovered something that would baffle authorities and caused this case to gain worldwide notoriety. Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. This is the strange death of Miroslav Kuklis. There were 7 people with Miroslav on the day that he died. Their accounts shed more light on what happened that day. According to them, on Tuesday the 10th of September, Miroslav and his group of friends were aboard a yacht at Poganesa Bay. The group was composed of individuals with various diving abilities, including 2 diving instructors and the yacht's captain. They were aware of the existence of the Poganesa cave, but they were uncertain about the exact location of its entrance. During dinner, Miroslav revealed to his friends that he might have discovered the entrance to the cave during a dive earlier that day. Initially, the group were skeptical, speculating that it could be simply a shallow niche in the seabed, but as the evening progressed and the drinks flowed, their curiosity prevailed and they decided to investigate. Around 9:15 p.m, a number of them put on their scuba gear, grabbed their flashlights and entered the water. The diving instructors paired with 2 other people and dove down to the cave entrance, whilst Miroslav stayed on the surface, shining his torch down to the seabed. 4 men entered the cave, navigating the narrow entrance tunnel before descending to a depth of approximately 35 meters. There they saw that the tunnel branched out into 2 paths, one leading to a vast open cavern and the other descending further into a deeper passage. After this initial assessment, the 4 men returned to the surface to discuss their findings. It seemed that this was indeed the Poganesa cave, but there was no chance that they would be able to explore it tonight. Zdenek Sreya, one of the diving instructors, said that he'd swam about 3 meters into one of the branching tunnels and he'd experienced a moment of mild panic when he was briefly unable to find his way back to the exits. This was enough for him. He concluded that they wouldn't be able to navigate the cave without a guideline, and the group agreed that they would have to come back another day with a different crew and better equipment. They continued to dive in the waters around the cave entrance. It was only some time later that they realised that Miroslav was missing. Slowly it dawned on them that at some point during their initial dive and their return to the surface, Miroslav Kuklis had entered the cave alone and he hadn't returned. To understand why this is so dangerous and why his friends became so worried at this point, we need to take a closer look at cave diving as an activity. Cave diving is without question one of the most dangerous hobbies in the world. Those entering an underwater cave are making a journey into an absolutely hostile environment where the slightest mistake can make the difference between life and death. Underwater caves are complex labyrinths of tight passages and twisting tunnels that can easily disorientate a person. Some caves have underwater currents flowing through them which can easily throw a diver off course, causing even the most seasoned individuals to lose their sense of direction. When the water is still, fine silt often accumulates on the walls and floors of the caves. The slightest movement from a diver can disturb this silt, quickly reducing visibility to near zero. In such conditions, flashlights become useless. The beam of light just reflects off the silt suspended in the water, blinding the diver. In tight tunnels, this phenomenon becomes particularly treacherous. As a diver squeezes through narrow passages, they may unknowingly stir up silt whilst kicking their legs. The danger often only becomes apparent on the return journey when visibility is reduced to nothing. Once disturbed, this silt can take a long time to settle, and with a limited air supply, waiting it out is not an option. Then there's nitrogen narcosis. At depths beyond 25 to 30 meters, the nitrogen in the air supply becomes increasingly narcotic, impairing cognitive functions and causing confusion, poor judgment and delayed reactions. The effects worsen the deeper you go, and high levels of stress are believed to intensify the symptoms. Given these factors, it's no surprise that drowning is the most common cause of death in cave diving. 15 minutes after they realised that Miroslav was missing, one of the diving instructors, Thomas Sladek, entered the cave to search for his missing friend, whilst 2 other divers remained at the entrance. They spent nearly an hour trying to locate Miroslav in the silted out cave, but were ultimately unsuccessful. The authorities were alerted around midnight, and 2 police divers arrived at the scene the following morning. At 8 AM the cave was still filled with silt. The police divers attached themselves to a buddy line and entered the cave. As further proof of how dangerous this cave is, one of the police divers, Oliver Marek, never made it out of the cave alive. During their search for Miroslav, Oliver let go of his buddy line and disappeared into the darkness. The other police diver narrowly escaped death too. He reached the surface with his air supply completely depleted. With the cave claiming 2 men, later that day professional cave divers were called in and they were able to extract the bodies of Miroslav Kuklis and Oliver Marek. It was only after extracting Miroslav's body that a strange discovery was made. Miroslav's cause of death appeared to be a knife wound in his chest. Upon examining the body, the coroner confirmed a stab wound which perfectly aligned with a corresponding tear in the diver's wetsuit. The knife had penetrated through the chest muscle on the left side, between the 4th and 5th ribs. It had gone in deep enough to stab into the upper lobe of the left lung, and it had cut through a critical blood vessel on the way. It appeared that Miroslav had been stabbed to death, but this raised a number of questions. Who was responsible? How was it done? And why stabbing? In such a dangerous environment, if you did want to murder someone, there'd be far easier ways to do it. Simply removing someone's regulator or cutting off their air supply would have been enough. Swinging a blade underwater in a cramped cave with enough force to penetrate someone's chest seemed like an impossible task, especially when you consider that diving knives aren't designed for stabbing. Whilst their edges are very sharp, the tips are often deliberately blunted to avoid accidents. Further investigation of the body revealed no defensive injuries on the deceased's arms or hands. It was also determined that the 11 cm deep wound in Miroslav's chest matched the length of his own diving knife. During the autopsy, small red spots were discovered under the outer surface of his lungs, along with a foamy white liquid inside. These findings indicated that he had attempted to breathe shortly after being stabbed and had inhaled water. The coroner concluded that Miroslav likely had died within 2 minutes or less after being stabbed. Naturally, suspicion fell on the 7 people who had been with Miroslav on the day of his death. They were promptly arrested and interrogated. The police's working theory was that Miroslav had been stabbed aboard the yacht by Daniel Frolek and Ivo Koznar. These were the 2 that had stayed on board whilst the others searched the cave. After killing Miroslav, it was thought that Daniel Frolek had dove into the cave with the body and then returned to the boat without any of the others noticing. All of the yacht's occupants were given a polygraph test and all of them passed except for Daniel and Ivo. Police also found a red stain on the boat which they believed to be blood. Their theory would eventually prove to be false. The polygraph findings were found to be unreliable and later analysis of the stain revealed it to be anti-fouling paint. As the autopsy showed that Miroslav had inhaled water immediately after being stabbed, the death must have occurred in the water, and his diving computer eventually proved that he'd been inside the cave when he died. The analysis of Miroslav's dive computer provided more details about his final moments. As I mentioned earlier, after squeezing through the entrance passage, the cave opens out into a large cavern which is known as the Shallow Gallery. Below this is another narrow passage, around 15 meters long, and this descends into the Deep Gallery, the deepest section of Poganesa Cave. Alone in the underwater cave, it seems that Miroslav decided to explore that tunnel. He was equipped with a 15-litre air cylinder, pressurised to 200 bars, and must have known the extreme risks of diving deeper than 30 metres whilst breathing regular air. Despite this, at the dark tunnel opening into Deep Gallery, Miroslav chose to push even further. Assessing the dive computer data, authorities deduced that upon entering the Deep Gallery, he descended straight to the bottom, to a depth of approximately 57 metres, before quickly ascending again. It seemed as if he was attempting to touch the lowest part of the cave before returning to the surface. But there was a problem. With no underwater current in the Poganisa cave, large amounts of silt were likely stirred up during his movements. With the visibility gone, Miroslav would have been engulfed in darkness. Trying to find his way back to the surface, Miroslav mistakenly entered the shallow gallery instead of the tunnel leading to safety. Divers who are familiar with this cave have pointed out that it has a so-called false exit which leads to the shallow gallery, and it closely resembles the actual exit to the surface. This can easily be mistaken even when the visibility is good. Data from the dive computer suggests that Miroslav got lost in the shallow gallery for approximately 40 minutes. Under normal conditions, the exit probably wouldn't have been that difficult to find, but at this point Miroslav was likely forced to rely solely on touch to find his way in the silt-filled cave. He was likely aware that he was running out of time, and his gas cylinder was nearly empty at this point. Professional divers often leave spare gas cylinders secured to a guide rope which leads to the surface. This allows them to switch tanks as they decompress, but Miroslav had made no such preparations. It was at this point it seems that he finally found the tunnel out. He wasted no time and entered it. Unfortunately, he'd made a grave error. The tunnel that he squeezed through didn't lead to the surface. It took him back down to Deep Gallery. By now, it was far too late to come back. He'd run out of air. Approximately 55 minutes into his dive, Miroslav found himself trapped against the roof of the Deep Gallery. He was about 35 metres below the seabed, trying to breathe from an air bubble trapped against the rocks. He remained there for about 5 minutes. After this, his dive computer recorded a vertical drop to the bottom of Deep Gallery. Strangely, the police officer who lost his life whilst trying to search for Miroslav's body died in almost exactly the same way. It was later revealed that Oliver Marek had lost his way in the shallow gallery. This was likely due to the large amount of silt still suspended in the water. He was unable to find the exit for approximately 35 minutes until, much like Miroslav, he mistook the tunnel to the Deep Gallery for the exit. Trapped in this narrow tunnel, he eventually ran out of air and drowned. Another theory was that Miroslav had waited for rescue inside Deep Gallery and then had lashed out when rescuers arrived. A person panicking underwater can often act on a primal instinct and will do anything they can to survive, even ripping the regulator from a rescuer's mouth. In such a scenario, it was theorised that the rescuer could have fought back to save themselves, and then a struggle ensued which resulted in the stab wound found in Miroslav's chest. Authorities ruled out this theory because a comparison from the data of the diving computer suggested that by the time his friends went back to search for him in the cave, Miroslav was already dead and at the bottom of the Deep Gallery. There does remain a slim possibility that Miroslav lost his diving computer whilst he was trapped in the air pocket. In such a scenario, the computer would have sunk to the bottom and remained there, recording no changes in depth or pressure, suggesting that the diver had drowned when really he was still at the top of the cave. Nevertheless, based on the evidence available, the authorities eventually concluded that during the 5 minutes that Miroslav was trapped at the top of the Deep Gallery, he had been completely alone. Therefore, they concluded the wound on his chest was self-inflicted. Given the hopelessness of his situation, it's understandable why this may have seemed like the better option. Drowning seems like a particularly unpleasant way to die. As the American writer Sebastian Junger puts it, the panic of a drowning person is mixed with the odd incredulity that this is actually happening. Having never drowned before, the body and mind don't know how to die gracefully. When the first involuntary breath is taken, most people are still conscious, which is unfortunate because the only thing more unpleasant than running out of air is breathing water. The clock is running down now. Half conscious and enfeebled by oxygen depletion, the drowning person is in no condition to fight. They have suffered for a minute or two, their bodies having imposed increasingly drastic measures to keep functioning. They finally started to shut down. Only the brain is alive, but its electrical activity gets weaker and weaker until after 15 or 20 minutes it ceases altogether. Unfortunately, if this is what happened, Miroslav's plan didn't go as intended. The autopsy revealed that he had both drowned and bled out simultaneously. This remains the official ruling on Miroslav's death, and it appears to be the most logical explanation, but there are some that still remain unconvinced. Some professional military divers have expressed their doubts, arguing that in an underwater emergency, a diver will always do everything possible to survive, regardless of the odds. Others have raised the question that if the official verdict really is true, wouldn't it have made more sense to use the sharp, cutting edge of the blade rather than the blunt tip? The act of thrusting a blunt knife through the ribcage in such confined conditions, suspended in water against the roof of the deep gallery whilst in complete darkness, seems almost impossible, and it would have been excruciatingly painful to pull off. Medical professionals researching this case were also puzzled. They published their findings in a Croatian medical journal, and they admitted that despite trying to find similar incidents to draw comparisons, Miroslav's death appeared to be the first ever recorded case of somebody dying in this manner. As they wrote, it's difficult to accept that such an incident has never been described before, because hundreds of thousands of scuba divers dive in the world every day. Darko Bujas, a diver who specialises in body retrieval operations, later said, "Night diving in a cave is the stupidest thing that can be done. It's like driving down the road at night at 200 miles an hour with the lights off." And yet, the Poganesa cave continues to attract divers from around the world. In the years following the incident, this cave has claimed many more lives. So, thank you for watching this video. I hope you found that interesting. I've done videos on caving and videos on diving, but never the two combined. As someone who gets quite claustrophobic in tight places, the idea of diving into a cave seems particularly horrifying, so I can't even imagine the horror of being trapped completely alone in the dark, that deep underwater. So thank you to the patrons for the support, it's much appreciated. If you want more content, then check out my channel, there's loads of videos on there if you're new here. And if you are one of those crazy people who goes cave diving, please stay safe. Okay, until next time, goodbye.